We don't usually read this version of the story of Easter morning from the Gospel according to John in our regular rotation. We usually read from year A in the 3-year cycle. We read from Matthew, year B, often from Mark, which is the Gospel that our bishop reflects on in the insert in her Easter message, and the year C we read Luke. But John in the second year is actually listed as the first option. And I find it interesting because whenever I read it, it hits me how easy it is to have our encounter with Jesus be a case of mistaken identity. Either we look for Jesus where he isn't, in our fantasies, in our projections, in social stereotypes and traditions, and we fail to see him where he is, which is often in the strangest places, including in our own souls. That was the case for Mary Magdalene at the tomb that first Easter morning. She thought Jesus was the gardener. I mean, how could that happen? I mean, Mary was as close to Jesus as any of the apostles, and according to some more recently researched literature, closer than that. She, not they, had stayed by the cross while he died. And it doesn't say in this story that Jesus was wearing some sort of disguise. He didn't have on a floppy gardener's hat with a wide brim covering his face. Or, wasn't holding a hoe there like some Midwestern painting. It must have been the context. She didn't expect to see Jesus, at least not alive, and so she didn't see him. She couldn't recognize him. And I understand that, because I'm a terrible proofreader. And you may notice, I don't know, I haven't seen anything today, but it's liable to be there. In the bulletin, I expect to see what I expect to see, and when I read something else, it just goes right over. I have that issue with sermons. I'll preach really heretical stuff, and nobody will notice. They'll just expect, oh, it went over my head, or they'll think I said something I didn't say. Or on a positive note, I've gotten to the back of the church, and people say, oh, that spoke right to me, and they'll proceed to tell me what I said and how it made a difference in their lives, and it doesn't seem to me to relate to anything I said. I'll take the credit. What we see, what we experience, is very often shaped by what we expect, our preconceived notions. It couldn't be otherwise, because we'd have to reinvent reality every time we opened our eyes. So we have these ingrained patterns. That's what culture is. That's what personality is. That's why therapists have people talk about childhoods and traumatic events, because our past experience determines the bounds, in some ways, of our hopes and dreams, and can also entomb our lives in ways, in repeated patterns. Long after those patterns have served any purpose that they may have had or brought any joy that was available. We get stuck in those ruts. We develop addictions. And we do that in spite of the boredom. We do it even in spite of the pain. Because it's what we're used to, and we at least feel secure with it. I remember seeing it a long time ago, this is dating myself, which isn't necessarily necessary for me to do verbally, but I remember Buddy Hackett was a comedian, and he talked about going into the army for the first time, and I don't know whether it was during World War II or sometime after that or before that. Anyway, he went in and he went to the mess hall and he ate dinner and he thought he was going to die. Because he said the fire had gone out. He'd grown up in his mother's home where everything she cooked gave him heartburn. And he thought that was the fire that kept his life going, and it had gone out. He didn't feel that. And so even with that pain, it provided the security that he needed, and that's true for a lot of people. In one of the gospel stories of Good Friday, Pontius Pilate is warned that the followers of Jesus might come in the night and try to steal the body. So he posts a guard, puts a stone, posts a guard, and says to them, make it as secure as you can. And in a lot of ways, that's become our mantra, to do anything we need to do to try to be as secure as we can. And maybe death can be made secure. One of the points of Easter is that life never can. Jesus is alive. And it's risky to realize that. What Mary needed was a change of perspective. I've told this story before in a different context when I was talking about fundamentalism, taking the Bible literally, but it's appropriate here, I think. I had a friend whose mother grew up in Arizona, and I'd forgotten the name of the town, but somebody at 8 o'clock mentioned Page, Arizona, and I think that was it. I think it was near there. It was a really small town. But her father was a professor in another place, and her mother was an attorney working in town, or maybe in another town. And she was kind of on her own. This was before, everybody was so concerned about getting full daycare coverage and never leaving kids alone for 2 seconds. And she had a lot of time on her own. And she was also very bright. She had a grandmother who watched her some, and grandmother was very religious and gave her a Bible to read when she was about 11 or 12. And she got to the point that said, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And she thought, at 12, that would be really neat. And so she went outside and she looked out at a distant mountain and she willed it to move. But it didn't move. So she shut her eyes and she visualized it moving. In California, we'd call that summoning up an intention. She thought really hard that it was in fact moving. And then she opened her eyes, and it hadn't moved. So she figured maybe she just didn't have quite enough faith. And she tried really hard a third time, shutting her eyes again and really, really believing, not just wishing, but believing that the mountain would move. But again, when she opened her eyes, the mountain was still there right in front of her, in the same place, unmoved. As I said, she's very bright. And this experience for her was quite disconcerting. It shook her sense of trust in the Bible, in her grandmother, in God. This was serious. So she bowed her head and walked down the road, lost in thought, out to the edge of town, down into the dry creek bed, and out into the desert, thinking about her grandmother and thinking about God, thinking about faith, and what did it mean? And then she looked up, and to her amazement, what she saw was different. She saw the mountain, but it wasn't right in front of her. It was over at the side. And where before she'd seen just a rocky side, now she saw this forest going partway up to the mountain. Now, she realized that, yeah, okay, she had moved, and maybe the mountain hadn't, but it was all part of one thing, and however it had happened, her perspective had changed, and maybe that was how faith worked too. Maybe that's how faith moved mountains. We just can't fit resurrection into our way of seeing things. We have to move. We have to find a different way of seeing things. Mary expected to find a dead body, not an empty tomb. And she certainly didn't expect to see Jesus. She was there at the death. And notice something else that gets woven into this story. It's the one whom John calls the disciple who Jesus loved, who gets to the tomb first after being called by Mary, before Peter, looks in, doesn't go in, Peter goes in, and then that disciple whom Jesus loved goes in, and it says he saw and believed. So he's the first one to believe. Which I think is a way of saying that faith and the insight that it brings follows love, comes out of relationship, which is kind of like the mountain and my friend's mother. So it was when Jesus called her by name, Mary, that she recognized it. So the call of Easter to us is twofold. We are called first to change our perspective, to erase our preconceptions about Jesus, about God, about faith, about ourselves, break open the routines and the ruts and the secure patterns that we've spent all this time figuring out. Ways that maintain our delusion that we have everything under our control. And then, once we're able to let go of that, open up to the ways that God is in control, that God is really presenting something to us and is also present to us and for us. In the church, in the people in our lives, in the sky and the earth and all the life around us. I mean, Jesus was the Word incarnate. But the Word also was the Word of creation. So it's that same reality that we can, if we can make that shift, we can see and experience that all around. And doing that, we open our hearts. We open to love and being loved, both of which are risky, both of which make us vulnerable. Loving someone makes us very vulnerable. Being loved makes us vulnerable. But both of those are necessary, I think, we're learning today, for a life that can truly respond to God's call, to God's presence. Mary responds when Jesus calls. Mary, he says, my teacher, she responds. We are called to be responsible. To be responsible to God, to be responsible to life, to be responsible to whatever that is, that truth is, that God is creating through us, that God is making us to be, which isn't a stereotype or a construction any more than Jesus is or God is. It's a unique miracle. It's not well defined. It's not prefabricated assembly line. Our truth is not secure and settled, locked up in some stone tomb of cliched roles or shallow expectations. It's amazing. It's miraculous. It's eternal. So have fun. Enjoy yourself. Play in the garden. Even wear a floppy hat if you want to. Jesus will lend you one. And you might meet Jesus. And meeting him, knowing him, loving him, like Mary, you will also meet and know and truly come to love yourself. Thanks be to God.